One question that I've always hated is, where are you from? Obviously, that exact question can be loaded with a lot of racist connotations sometimes, especially when you let a really to it. But even when it's not, or when someone asks a less antagonistic version of the question, like, where do you call home? I never quite know how to answer it. Throughout my life, I've had the privilege of calling a lot of different places home. In fact, just this summer, I started off in the Chicago suburbs for a few weeks before heading to Accra, Ghana for a little while and seeing my family. Then I went to London, England, where I was able to catch up with some old friends and make use of public transport in ways I wish I could on in Southern California. And now I'm finishing it off in sunny Southern California, which I've called home for the past 3 years since I started going to college here. All of these are places that I call or have called home at some point in my life. So it feels weird trying to answer the question, well, where do you call home, with like a one word answer, the city I live in, like Chicago. What's maybe even more interesting about calling many different places home is that I experience different parts of myself when I'm in these different places. For example, going back to Ghana was so fascinating for me because it had been a while since I'd been back. But it felt like as soon as I stepped out of the airport, a past me was reawakened. While I was there, I barely heard my English name because I was almost always referred to as Araba, my Fanti name, which when I'm outside of Ghana, I only hear it if my family calls me it. But being back there was like I shifted from being Kristen to being Araba. Like I awakened a different self. When I learned about Maria Lugones' concept of world traveling, I deeply resonated with it. In a literal sense, I've already done some world traveling this summer and throughout my life. But when Lugones talks about world traveling, she's not referring to the literal practice of traveling between different locations across the world. She's talking about the experience of inhabiting different selves. So, yeah, I said that when I stepped foot in Ghana, I entered a different self. But this experience of being a different self isn't just limited to when I travel to a different place. I can be my Ghanaian self when I'm in the US. I can be an American version of myself when I'm in Ghana. Whatever it is, there's just this constant feeling of like shifting through different versions of myself. And this is the phenomenon which Lugones discusses as world traveling. She first uses the phrase world traveling in her essay, Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception. In this essay, she begins by situating her analysis in a desire to understand plurality of women. And she contextualizes this within an exploration of her failure to love her mother, which she likens to white women's failure to love women across racial and cultural boundaries in the US. She argues that this problem can be somewhat addressed through world traveling. In order to understand this failure to love, Lugones uses a concept employed by Marilyn Fry in her 1983 essay, In and Out of Harm's Way, Arrogance and Love. In this essay, Fry differentiates loving perception and arrogant perception. Fry looks at these concepts regarding the relationship between men and women, noting how women are often the object of arrogant perception. Arrogant perception is an outlook that places an individual's own desires and beliefs at the teleological center, meaning that everyone else's needs and desires come secondary to the individual's. In and of itself, this doesn't necessarily sound all that problematic, but it results in a disregard and lack of care for others. Lugones expands on Fry's concept to include women's relationships with other women. She argued that there is a failure to love those who you perceive arrogantly. She came to realize that white people engage in arrogant perception towards POC. And this is the part of the reason why white women fail to love POC women. Their failure to love women of color also leads to them ostracizing women of color and rendering them invisible. Lugones underscores this finding with the claim that in the US and Argentina, where she's from, for the most part, women are taught to perceive other women arrogantly. So they can be both the object and perpetrator of arrogant perception. Thus, whether white women are entirely responsible for this arrogant perception towards women of color is up in the air. She notes this, but she doesn't really dwell on it because culpability isn't as much a concern to her as the more tangible effects that this presumption has. Nevertheless, her solution to overcoming this arrogant perception towards other women is to enter the world of another woman. Through this, we can come to identify with the other women, which is the only way that we can begin to love them. You can't love someone if you can't identify with them. So traveling to another woman's world is an inroad to learning to love them. When Lugones talks about worlds, she's not referring to possible worlds. For her, a world must be inhabited by people. She says that for something to be a world, in my sense, it has to be inhabited at present by some flesh and blood people. That's why it can't be a utopia. World can also be actual societies. This view of a world differs to those often found in analytic philosophy. Lugones says that in a particular world, an inhabitant may not see themselves in the way that said world sees them. How the individual recognizes themselves internally may contrast to how they're outwardly perceived. It also might be the case that the self one presents in one world is different to the self that they present in another. Lugones uses the example of playfulness, describing that in some worlds she's seen as a playful person, but in others she's not. She also explains that it's possible to exist in multiple worlds and to travel between worlds. World traveling can be out of desire or out of necessity. For individuals that are not of dominant groups, they're world travelers out of necessity for survival. They're often forced to travel to worlds in which others have a limited view of them. World travelers have a unique experience wherein they experience being a different person in the different world, but recognizing that the different person is all the same self. That makes sense. They're able to go between worlds and remember what it's like to be in the different worlds. So the practice of traveling for Lugones is the specific experience of shifting from different persons or selves on going between worlds. The shift isn't simply like acting as a different person. It can be done at will, but it's still a shift between different selves that the individual possesses. So the shift isn't about just choosing to act in a different way. It's about actually moving between different selves that one has. When one goes between worlds, there are certain worlds that they feel more at ease in. Lugones describes the four ways that one can be at ease in a world. Firstly, being a fluent speaker in that world, meaning that one understands the language of the world and the norms that are to be followed. Two is to be normatively happy, so meaning that one agrees with all of the norms in that world. Thirdly, being humanly bonded to the world. So that means being with people you love in a world. So you can still be at ease in this world, even if it's hostile, because you're with those that you love. And finally, if one has a history with others that's shared, meaning that, for example, if you all have a shared memory of an event that occurred, you all have something in common. So what this means for marginalized individuals who are forced to world travel is that in some worlds, they may feel that the self that they present is nearer to their interior sense of selves. And this is because they're more at ease in that world. But sometimes they present a self that is very different to their interior sense of self because they're not at ease in that world, or because the world is constructed in a way in which it is difficult for the individual to be their true self. Lugones returns to the example of playfulness to illustrate the point, using these ideas as a reason for why she's not playful in some worlds. Because world travelers are able to remember the experiences of being in the different worlds that they travel to, They may develop a double vision of themselves when the selves that they have in different worlds contrast. If Lugones is in a world where she's playful, she may remember a world in which she was unplayful, and this leads to this double imaging. Lugones says, as Latin American, I am an ambiguous being, a two-imaged self. She understands how the other worlds which she enters perceive her. Because of this, she might animate the other world stereotype of her while being in the world. This could be intentional or not, but it's for the purpose of survival. Not only is world traveling a way of better understanding others, but it can also be used as an effective strategy of resistance for people in marginalized positions. Lugones locates the key to resistance in playfulness. For her, playfulness is an attitude. It's an openness to surprise and self-construction. Through positive playfulness, one can reconstruct themselves in the world which they travel to. And it helps us understand how we might fall subject to perceiving others arrogantly. Positive playfulness is key for Lugones. She also underscores that we can only resist and achieve liberation through embracing the liminality of ourselves, the liminality we possess because of our existence in multiple worlds. Now, you might be wondering whether people who aren't in marginalized groups can be world travelers. Well, anyone can world travel. As Lugana says, it's the way through which white women can come to understand and empathize with people of color. So it can be practiced by all, regardless of where you are in society. However, sometimes when people in dominant groups practice world traveling, it can result in presumptuously entering spaces that aren't welcome to them. This occurs when dominant group members attempt to enter other worlds without permission or worlds where they're not wanted. This can be the case for anyone, really, not just on group members. As a Black woman, I might try to travel to the world of Latinas, even though I'm not welcome there. And in doing so, I would be engaged in harmful world traveling. But this most frequently happens with people from dominant groups. Shannon Sullivan terms this phenomenon ontological expansiveness. I'll have another video where I go into that in more depth. But ontological expansiveness describes this act or destructive world traveling. In practice, this would look like presumptuously entering into any space, the assumption that the space is open to you. Like a white person entering a place that is supposed to be a safe space for people of color. This can be a drawback of world traveling. Even if the intentions of entering the space aren't harmful, or if the individual is practicing love while traveling, it can still be harmful when a space is designated for a specific group of people and their safety is interrupted by someone who isn't meant to be in said space. As well as ontological expansiveness, world traveling practiced by dominant group members can also result in these worlds being harmfully romanticized or exoticized by the people traveling to them. However, even though there can be harm in dominant group members world traveling, this doesn't mean that they should never practice it. As long as they're engaged in what Mariana Ortega calls critical world traveling, and it's not problematic for them to travel worlds. So this means understanding when it's beneficial to world travel and when travel will bring more harm than good. This also means engaging in world traveling for a reason, not just for fun, but actually with the purpose of understanding another person's world and learning from it. World traveling is something which marginalized group members do out of necessity, but it's also a way that we can come to better understand and love each other. To love another woman is to know their world. So for white women to begin to love women of color, they must lovingly travel to their worlds. We can world travel at will, and in doing so, better identify with others. I'll end with a quotation from Lugones, which I think sums up the beauty of world traveling. By traveling to their worlds, we can understand what it is to be them and what it is to be ourselves in their eyes. Only when we have traveled to each other's worlds are we fully subjects to each other. Let's learn to love each other and know each other better by lovingly traveling to each other's worlds.